Okay, friends, so thank you for coming again, and I'm going to try to build on some of the themes that the previous speakers outlined for us, but I have to say that my talk will be slightly more narrow in its scope, and I'd like to do two things today. The first thing is I'd like to show you a little bit of my research, and as also, like Martin, as a historian, I write histories of artificial intelligence, and a particular subset of that history. Now, AI in general is a big field. AI in language, AI in robotics, AI in vision, different technologies. It's a cluster of technologies, but we often will just say AI. And here I'd like to really confront the history of machine translation. Actually, the history of that, right there to the left, which is pretty cool. Though, note when Martin was saying users, he kept saying losers, which I kind of didn't like. So I want to broadly give you like a crash course. We only have, actually, let me set a timer. We have only 20 minutes, so I'm gonna like put the timer. Let's call it a time nap, 20 minutes, there we go. So 20 minutes, maybe like 10 or so minutes in this crash course of machine translation, of the history of machine translation, which I hope will be interesting for humanists, and it will be interesting for technologists. I want to kind of provide you this, but we don't have time, so I'll just put on this historical timeline, or I'll put just a few milestones and markers in that history, and Martin already gave us some of the deeper roots of that history. But the second thing I'd like to do is really challenge a particular social and philosophical notion of universal language, and you'll see what I mean by this, and really universal intelligence and general intelligence. So if you're interested in AGI, universal general intelligence, this will be kind of the subtext, the argument against universal intelligence, but it's not just an argument I make. You'll see that it's an actual lineage, a historical line in the history of machine translation that loses out. That's not where we are today. We're not in the machine translation world, in this general intelligence land, okay? Now, when I often read about translation, machine translation, often there's this, people remember the Babel fish from Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker Guide to the Galaxy. If you remember, it's sort of a science fiction novel from some time ago. Also a great BBC special. I think this is a screenshot from the BBC special. And in this novel, Douglas Adams imagines a fish that you stick inside of your ear, and it's kind of gross, it's slimy. You stick inside, and it's a telepathic fish, and it gives you perfect telepathic translation between two people. And sort of, you can understand all languages, and you can travel the galaxy, you can hitchhike the galaxy, and all the aliens are accessible to you. And when you read, it's funny, when you read it, it's a funny vision, but I also want to suggest today that this is somewhat a horrific image, a perfect telepathic communication. Would you like to, here is a translation of my speech that goes through several layers of mediation. However, if I gave you direct telepathic access to my brain, do you want that really? Please ask yourself. I suggest not, but we'll see why. So this is kind of the image I'd like us to object a little bit, though, when you actually read, and I spend a lot of time, I am an English professor, but I read a lot of engineering manuals. I read a lot of engineers who are responsible for creating technologies like this, and very often they will cite the Babel fish as like, that's actually what they're building. They're building the Babel fish. And again, I will argue that this is perhaps a mistaken dream that we have, the dream of perfect communication. Now, this dream of perfect communication, one of the major milestones of this dream was a book written in the 17th century by John Wilkins, one of the founder of the Royal Society. And Wilkins was a linguist, a historian, a philosopher, polymath, and he wrote this book called An Essay on Real Character. And I sort of love this book. I teach this book all the time. It's really a strange book. And in this book, he imagines the universal character. He imagines the perfect language. What does this perfect language look like? So first of all, what he does is he takes everything that exists in the world and he inspired, by the way, inspired by Chinese. I'm not sure that he knew about Korean, but there's kind of Korean-like elements in there as well. But he takes every concept in the world and he gives it a character. And then these characters become composable. You can take each line of this character and then you can put them together. And his vision is that this language will be so perfect that it's impossible to put together something that is an imperfect thought. The thoughts you will write in this language will always be perfect. And then he says in the introduction, the universal language will bring about peace on earth. There will be no more wars because people will understand each other perfectly. And he has a whole paragraph about commerce, how the perfect language will facilitate worldwide global commerce, if only we adopt his system. Now, it's a big book. It's 800, 900 pages. He also uses it to translate many passages from the Bible. You can see his translations underneath there. They look something like this. I give my students an assignment to actually learn this language and to translate other things into John Wilkins' universal language. They enjoy that as a lab activity. This language doesn't go anywhere, really. He's ridiculed by his colleagues at the Royal Society, except one man, whose name is Leibniz, is kind of interested in this as a foundations of calculus and ends up kind of referencing it maybe somewhat negatively, but point is this does has a little bit of a history in the land of calculus. And that's the sort of this dream of universal language of John Wilkins. Now, let's forward. This was 17th century. Let's teleport forward, several hundred years. At the end of the 19th century, a philosopher named Bertrand Russell is creating another universal language. He's writing his Principia Mathematica in Cambridge. And Principia Mathematica is another one of these. It is a continuation of the dream by Wilkins and by Leibniz. Let's create logic, and it's going to be a philosophical language incapable of falsity. Now, for Russell, this wasn't a general use language, this was a technical language for philosophers, but you see it's part of the same. He's more modest about his goals, but it's kind of in that vein. And to further this amazing, innovative, cutting-edge research paradigm, he invites a young, brilliant philosopher, Ludwig Wittgenstein. And Ludwig Wittgenstein joins Cambridge, also in the beginning thinking about this problem of communication and universal language. And Wittgenstein really is obsessed with this question. He's obsessed with the question of how is it possible, like I'm talking to you, but maybe you are not really understanding me, and so I have to test you, like what we do as educators. I have to give you an exam. Did you actually get what I'm saying? Is this correct? Let me test you, and then you say it back to me, but then you have to test me back, and then I have to end points. It becomes a mess. And initially, Wittgenstein thinks he can solve it because he thinks he's brilliant. But with time, he begins to abandon this project. And there's kind of a hole. We're not going to go into Wittgenstein. It's not the important part today. The important part today is in a special moment in 1939. Two students attend Wittgenstein's lecture. One of them is the young Ellen Verne, and the other one is the young Margaret Mesterman, who is a pioneer of machine translation. And both of them, I will argue, I have argued in my published work, they are answering the conundrum that Wittgenstein puts before them. They're answering the conundrum, is perfect language possible? Is perfect translation possible? But not just translation between English and Korean, or German and Russian, really just a translation between people. Our incommensurate context between, even if we're speaking the same language, we're still having a problem of translation. And for Turing, it's a translation between a person and a machine. Can we ensure, can we imagine a mechanism that will perfectly understand me and will always follow my instructions exactly? And when it doesn't, it actually throws in an exception. And so Turing one way to view Turing's machines, Turing's universal computing machines, is an answer to Wittgenstein's kind of conundrum. Again, Turing, well known, we can talk about it later. Now, Masterman, when she graduates, she stays in Cambridge and she starts one of the first machine translation labs. And initially, this lab, it begins with this Wittgensteinian question about perfect language. And initially, they developed this notion they call interlingua. And interlingua, they also developed a computing language called Nude. And Nude, the computing language called Nude, takes any phrase in any language and it nudes it, it denudes it of any cultural context, leaving behind that perfect sort of statement, and then it puts the clothes back on. That was their original plan. Now, a little bit of a wild part as I'm following the detective line of their kind of historical, archival trace that this lab leaves behind, I realized that neither Margaret nor many of her colleagues, they're not really coders, and also they don't really have computers yet. A lot of their machine translation is theoretical, or they build sort of theoretical machines and they experiment theoretically. It's very interesting. So initially, they follow this history. They follow this research paradigm of can we create an interlingua that's going to be perfect, and it's a perfect language. But with time, they realize that this is not working out. The interlingua, they create an interlingua, they publish it, they experiment with it, they try to actually kind of by hand translate from English to interlingua and from interlingua to German, and it's just not working very well. And they're more or less forced to abandon this paradigm. They abandon the paradigm of the universal language. Meanwhile, in England, one of the linguists that is being quite active, and another interesting side quest here, there is a competition happening between Cambridge and some of the MIT, Harvard kind of linguists, and there is a quite an influential person a British linguist that is writing at this time, and his name is John Firth. And John Firth kind of, in graduate school, I did linguistics quite a bit. I never heard of this guy. I rediscovered him, and it's interesting why he drops out of the history of linguistics. But John Firth has one of the most fundamental insights for machine translation and actually for the history of AI. And his insight is that words mean things in context. Words mean things in context. The famous phrase he's known for, a word is known by the company it keeps. What is a hat? You don't just look at the definition of a hat. What is a person? You don't look at the definition. What is a soup? You just kind of encounter soups in many different contexts, and that constellation of context is in fact the definition of the word. So words and context is something that he develops. He influences I.A. Richards, incidentally, quite a bit. Richards and his team create this English through pictures, best-selling series of books to teach English in foreign context. By the way, Firth joins the Ministry of Education in Punjab, and because he does foreign service, so he actually thinks quite a bit about teaching English and extending the British Empire in other contexts. So Richards and others also write quite a bit about this words and context idea, and this idea filters back to the lab of Margaret Masterman, because this is like their local British. They're like, let's defend the British linguistics against the incursion of American linguistics. And so the later work of Margaret Masterman's lab abandons the interlingua in favor of the context paradigm. And together with somebody called Catherine Spark-Jones, who takes the idea of context words to information science. She's a librarian. She's interested in document retrieval. She's interested in, if you're searching for the word soup, it's and you're searching for a recipe, you need to find the context of soup and recipe, and context of soup and recipe is different from context of soup in 19th century novel or some other text. So the idea that the document retrieval will be driven by context comes out of this lab and eventually ends up being kind of page rank type of stuff powering today's Google and search engine. And eventually, by the way, this leads directly to the vectorization of language, which is large language models. Large language models is a mathematical way to express words in context. It's just mathematically. We can now sort of put it all in the same model and say what is, the famous example, king minus royalty plus female. What does that equal? Queen, right? So you're able to operate with context and just look at the semantic neighborhood of words. And through that semantic neighborhood, the model doesn't need to know anything about male or female or royalty or war. It just knows that these things occur in similar contexts. And that's, in short, vectorization. This is kind of the lineage through Spark-Jones, through Margaret Masterman, through the contextual history. Oh my God, we're out of time. Now, let's forward until this January 2025. History of machine translation. That was kind of the romp through history, the several milestones I will give you. In January 5th, 2025, Lex Friedman, an American podcaster, gave an interview to Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. And this was hailed, this was a very important event, an important interview, but also it was hailed as kind of a triumph of machine translation, because the machine translation was done by a company called 11 Labs. And 11 Labs is an AI-enabled kind of machine translation tool, kind of similar to this, only even more advanced. Because when I was watching this interview, I was watching it in English with the words, both speakers spoke English, their lips were synchronized to English, their intonation, they spoke in their own voice, until I realized, wait a second, this interview did not happen in English. And in fact, what's fascinating to me as a literary scholar, the first 40 minutes of this interview, Lex Friedman, who now I dislike strongly, argues with Zelensky about which language they're going to speak. And so he wants to insist that the president of Ukraine will give the interview in Russian, because this will somehow bring about peace on earth. And so he insists, and Zelensky first nicely says, look, as an official of Ukraine, I cannot, you understand that language differences were actually part of the casus belli. That's why we went to war in part. You have to understand that I cannot, even though I speak your language. And Friedman is an American who is originally from Kazakhstan. So these are the intertwined histories of these people. And Friedman insists until 40 minutes through the interview, instead of discussing anything except language policy, Zelensky says, look, I will answer in whatever language I like, and you answer your question in whatever language you like, and then we'll figure it out later. So you can imagine in the room, there are also translators. There's a team of translators on top of the 11 Labs team. And now they're tearing their hair out, because rather than having an interview in one language, which they can translate like this, they're speaking at the very least 3 languages, and sometimes a mix of them in the same sentence. And that's kind of all happening at the same time. They're speaking some blend between Ukrainian, Russian, and English. And all of this is being translated automatically in this fashion. It's being transcribed, it's being translated, and it's being reanimated into their voices and then reinserted back to YouTube. And on YouTube, you can select which track. Do you want to hear the original? Do you want to hear the whole thing in English, the whole thing in Ukrainian, or the whole thing in Russian? Now, at some point of this interview, a very important point, Lex Friedman asks Zelensky about corruption. He says, isn't it true that when Americans give you money for weapons, all this money gets frittered away, and it's just all gets, disappears into corruption? And Zelensky, the president, says, no, it's not true. We slapped, and he says, we slapped every hand. We punished, meaning we punished everyone. We punish everyone. He says it's wartime. When we encounter corruption during wartime, it's criminal. It's a very serious offense. However, the team at 11 Labs translates it, we slapped them on the wrist, which is exactly the opposite, which means light punishment, which means we ignore it. So the translation, and this is an absolute key moment of the interview that gets mistranslated. And of course, this is YouTube, so the commentary in the YouTube piles in and says, wait a second, this is not what he meant, this is a mistranslation, you have to, this is like absolute, so the chat explodes, and so several days later, the two teams meet. Zelensky's team meets with Lex Friedman's editorial team, and they retranslate and reinsert the appropriate context, the appropriate translation into the interview. They have the community vote between all possible. They allow YouTubers to vote on the correct translation, and they reinsert the winner, which is the correct one. We punished everyone. That's the meaning, into the context. And so we began with this dream of universal translation. We began with this incredible magical technology of resyncing our voices with translation, but a careful case study of machine translation in the wild shows us the messiness of the technology. It shows us what Amanda told us about AI. It's always mediated through institutions. It's always mediated through the social practice. And so looking back at the tangled mess of messages between these two recipients, separated by language, by medium, by war, by technology, I cannot help but revisit the evolving history of machine translation. No, it can never become fish or magic or thank God, not telepathy, as Douglas Adams imagined it. The task of the translator remains a doggedly human, analog enterprise, mired in aesthetic and political conundrums. Halfway between poetry and doctrine, as Walter Benjamin had it, translation cannot be solved in the way of checkers or train schedules or Sudoku puzzles. Its mystery deepens by the measure of entrenched difference between two strangers, so similar, yet unable and unwilling to become one. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tenen. For the response, Professor Na-Hee Kim from the German department would you?
Thank you very much for your insightful and very lively presentation of the limits of machine translation or history of machine translation. And though your journey must have been very, very long and tiring, you brought a better weather with you today. Thank you. My name is Kim Na-Hee from the Department of German Language and Literature at this university. And I invited to this conference despite majoring in German studies, I think. I believe because of my background in theory and practice in translation, interpreting between Korean and German. Originally, I prepared this speech or the discussing points in Korean in my native language. But due to a last-minute change, I switched to English with help of generative AI. So you are going to hear it. You are going to hear my English in generative AI assistance. So I want to ask for your understanding, as my English may carry a mix of Korean and German accent, which could affect clarity. As a professional interpreter, I'm more used to doing interpretation actually than being interpreted. This is also my first time attending a conference with machine translation, and I find both very exciting and thought-provoking. I see so many limits of machine translation and still quite interesting points. I would like to offer my remarks not so much as a formal discussion, but rather as thoughts that came to mind after reading and listening to your presentation. Your example of the multilingual podcast featuring Ukrainian President Zelensky and Friedman powerfully illustrated several key points. First, the political nature of language choice, who speaks in what language. Second, the difficulty of interpreting when multiple languages are used. And the third, the errors machine translation can produce and the limits of machine translation. Fourth, the human involvement behind so-called machine translation. You also emphasized the importance of context, culture, society in translation and interpretation, points I fully agree with. The themes of multilingual settings and the political nature of language and the importance of context reminded me of interpreting experience I had 2011 in Dresden, Germany, during the FIFA Women's World Cup. North Korean women team had just lost 0-2 to the top-ranked US team. And I was assigned to interpret the post-match press conference. The session was delayed, adding to the tension in the room, especially given the political sensitivity of the North Korean-US match. When the North Korean delegation arrived, consisting of the team captain, coach, and a female representative, I was surprised when the woman began speaking in English, not Korean. Officially, I was assigned to interpret Korean into German and vice versa, and another colleague of me from German into English or vice versa. And the North Koreans had brought their own Korean English interpreter. This created a complex interpreting chain. If the North Koreans spoke Korean, I would interpret into German simultaneously, then into English, also simultaneously done by my partner, based on my German. Afterwards, their North Korean interpreter would give a consecutive English version of Korean remarks, which would then be interpreted back into German and finally into Korean again. We decided not to repeat the cycle, stopping after the first round, but the situation felt almost absurd. The coach then gave a serious emotional account of the team's difficult training conditions. Then he said, "Some of our players were struck by lightning." I froze. Was this a metaphor? An idiom? Or was it a literal? I had no context for such an expression in North Korean speech. I had to respond quickly, so I translated literally into German. Einige unserer Spielerinnen wurden vom Blitz getroffen. The reaction was immediate. Journalists and the English interpreter stared at my booth in confusion, clearly questioning if the interpretation was working. The coach meant it literally. During training, some players had been hit by real lightning. He claimed they had taken ginseng for treatment, which led to a positive doping test. Ginseng isn't banned, so he insisted it wasn't doping. The press conference delay was due to this very issue. North Korea was trying to avoid a ban from the next World Cup. Ultimately, the doping test results were confirmed and North Korea was excluded from the 2015 tournament. This unforgettable experience raises important questions. What is the political weight of language choice as your example? What responsibility does an interpreter carry in representing speech across cultures and ideologies? Even when people speak the same language, differences in dialect, context, and meaning can create significant challenges too. And in such moments, the interpreter is not just translating words, but meaning, intent, and truth, or at least trying. I think you are saying that the machines cannot. Maybe I understood you correctly or not. The Korean honorific system you are mentioning in your presentation, actually in your paper, is very complex, involving grammar, lexics, and pragmatics. It also depends on the relationship between speaker, listener, and the third parties. While English and German lack such a system, this doesn't make them less respectful, just different. Not long ago, machine translation often failed to capture the nuance of Korean honorifics, leading to misunderstandings. I watched when our vice president was deliver a speech. He was saying I and I and I, but these machine translation just first stated na as like one-to-one correspondence, but then it changes into cha. It's kind of setting the relation between the public and the speaker. So as a speaker, you are actually saying that cha, and that catches that in the meantime. Machine translation has improved rapidly thanks to the better software. I'm not an expert at all, but I think they are getting better in hardware and software and data. Tools like Google Translate and DeepL now reflect much of the contextual meaning and cultural meaning too. And generative AIs can produce translation that are surprisingly good. The progress raises important questions about the future of human translation and interpretation indeed. After this speech, session, I must rush to interpret a joint Korean-German event in Daegu, a student robot club competition. Surprisingly, the organizer, who speaks no English or German, managed to coordinate with the German side using generative AI. She translated and summarized the German correspondence without my help. I was amazed. The AI-generated translations were clear, polite, and culturally very sensitive. This successful communication enabled both teams to prepare well for today's upcoming event. I hope my English text, assisted by AI as it is, has also been translated well. From the perspective of speech and cost, machine translation has already surpassed my human translation. As technology improves, this gap will only widen. In complex, multilingual contexts, AI-human collaboration is becoming essential. While something may be labeled as AI translation, it often involves human input, just as your example. Likewise, many human translations now include AI assistance too. This collaboration is no longer optional, I think. It's necessary, I'm afraid. Does this make me as a supporter of machine translation? Or saying that human translation interpreters are not needed? Definitely not. I am cautious when the word perfect is used in discussions about translation or communication. I believe that the limitations of human language, the limits of human communication, and the difference between linguistic expression and thought have always been existed, even without considering cross-linguistic interaction, and they will continue to exist. Even when people speak the same language and difference in time and space, context can create also misunderstandings. I fully agree that beneath every act of communication lies a difference in perspective and experiences. Translation and interpretations are, at their core, persistent human efforts to bridge these differences. Human translation remains meaningful and valuable, not in spite of machine translation, but because of the human analog effort itself. And for this reason, I believe humans will continue to translate and interpret for as long as we humans write, speak, and seek to understand each other in different languages. So I hope that we can find some time to discuss it further. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much for these comments, and also what an incredible honor to have a working translator and a scholar to kind of comment on this. By the way, I did end up cutting. There was a part of the talk which I cut, which had to do with the honorifics, and my point was to say that so often, the Korean language, and the important part is not just the language, it's Korean culture has more customs around respect and age, and the honorific system is much more complicated than English. And it's not that Americans are incapable of understanding it, but point is that the culture is different. The context are not the same. And so part of translation, if I understood your point correctly, is not just translating the literal meaning of the words, but we are trying to understand how these two contexts can understand each other. And part of it, as you beautifully said, is building a bridge, but part of it is actually respecting the incommensurability between contexts. I can never be you. I can never fully understand Korean culture. I try, but it's always an effort. And actually, for me, that's a sign of respect, and it's a sign of hope for the translation as a profession, because machine translation, just translating the words, is just a part of what is happening. The much larger part, as these case studies show, is attempting to mediate between different cultures and very different contexts. And there's no one solution to do this. Now, that's kind of a philosophical point, the incommensurability of context. I think that's you know, we can think about it. But practically, for those of you in the audience who are in an engineering program, today the low-hanging fruit of just translating the semantics has been kind of more or less solved. And so now I have engineers coming into my classroom who are asking the cultural question. They're asking, so for a real example, I have a group of engineers show up in my lab and they go, our ChatGPT is not funny. We want to make it more funny. And I go, what do you mean more funny? What's funny to you? And we start I'm like, tell me some jokes. We start kind of talking, what is funny to you? What is funny? And this group was actually coming from different cultures. There were some students from Chinese culture, from Indian culture, from German culture, from Russian culture. Very different senses of humor. I asked them, what's funny for your grandma? What's funny for your aunt is different from the kind of joke you will say in a bar while you're drinking. And so the naive engineering approach is often to say, let's just make it more funny. But as soon as they go to this next level to say that whatever that funny is, or whatever respect is, must be contextualized to the linguistic encounter, you're all of a sudden, you go, welcome to the world of the humanities. There's not one answer. There's not an easy answer. Now we have to think of technologies that are contextually aware. And when we look at actual case studies, the examples you brought, the case study I brought in this lecture, you see that the machine part, the transliteration part, again, is just a small part of the encounter, and the far larger, difficult task of the translator is the political one. When you have war, when you have people from different backgrounds trying to not just understand each other, trying to purposefully misunderstand each other often, trying to purposefully trip someone up, trying to purposely misinform. That's translation, and that's the kind of translation that cannot be solved by machinistic means. And though the work of a contemporary translator is complicated by technologies like this, but the translation program here at KNU, I gave a similar talk in Italy as well, actually, and in front of practicing translators, and I said, don't worry, your job will get more complicated, but it's safe, because we're not going to solve war or human conflict or that fundamental problem of being incommensurate, being strangers with one another.
Thank you very much, Professor Tenen.